All right. Thank you all for coming today. My name is Hans Greimel. I'm the Asia editor for Automotive News, based here in Tokyo. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this professional luncheon today. I'll begin with a few introductory remarks about the reason we're holding it and the kind of the time peg for this. It was back in the fall of 1997 when Toyota kind of ushered in the new age of electrified cars by introducing the Prius hybrid. It was developed at the time by an engineer named Takeshi Uchiyamada, and he kind of envisioned it as a car that would meet the emissions needs or the emission standards of the 21st century. At the time, it was a breakthrough technology, but it was kind of also dismissed by its critics as being kind of gimmicky, too impractical, and too costly. Despite all that, Uchiyamada's team pushed on through with kind of a make-or-break crisis mentality, and said he took inspiration from Japan's efforts in the closing days of World War II to build a jet-powered fighter aircraft. Now, that fighter aircraft actually came to fruition. It's called the Nakajima Kika, but it only flew once, and that's the week before Japan actually surrendered. Now, the Prius actually went on to have a much better future, much brighter future for it. It became, of course, the world's top-selling hybrid nameplate, and its sales have eclipsed about 4 million vehicles since its launch in 1997. Now, since then, of course, hybrid powertrains have propagated across the Toyota lineup and across to basically every major automaker. Toyota has sold more than 10 million hybrids to date across 34 different models. So basically 36 models it offers in a hybrid variety. And then, of course, Uchiyamada went on to become today's current chairman of Toyota Motor Corporation. But despite all that, electric vehicles, or electrified vehicles, still remain just a small sliver of the overall world market. But now we're at another turning point as the momentum behind electric cars, electrified cars, becomes greater and greater. We see countries from China and India and across Europe now mandating electrified or electric cars. That's putting new pressure on old school makers and inviting new makers to join the field to develop these vehicles. And a recent study by Reuters indicated that some $90 billion are being channeled into developing these electric vehicles. Of course, there are some still major hurdles to this. These technologies are very costly. There's no guarantee that today's consumers even want the cars. And of course, there's infrastructure hurdles. Today's societies don't really have the recharging or the refueling infrastructure to deal with these new kinds of cars. On top of all that, this flood of new investment is being further pressured by other investment needs in other new next-generation technologies like autonomous driving and connected cars. So faced with all this, it's no wonder then that Toyota President Akio Toyoda has described the industry being at a kind of a crossroads, or at a now or never battle, in his words, not about winning and losing, but simply about surviving. So what kind of technologies do you think will win in the long run? How will car makers balance these diverse investment needs? And how are Japan's automakers suited or situated to deal with this kind of uncertain future? Today's guests will talk about those issues and more. And I'd like to introduce to my right here is Christopher Richter from CLSA, and Koji Endo on the far right from SBI Securities. Both of them are veterans of the auto industry or auto analysis industry here in Tokyo, with some 50 years of combined experience in the field. I think a lot of us in the room are familiar with these two experts because we go to them often for expert outside opinion. So I'd like to turn it over to them now. Each of them will make a few remarks, and then we'll turn it over to questions in the remainder half of this presentation. Thank you. Chris, do you want to take the lead?
Hi. Thanks, Hans. Thanks for the great introduction. And I agree with Hans. It's a fascinating time for the auto industry. A little bit scary. I would call this a once-in-a-century event. Because if you think about it, from the early days of the 20th century up until 1997, when you had the first Prius hybrid, it had been all about purely internal combustion engines. So really a time with no change in the basic drivetrain, and now we're looking at a lot of different stuff. My first point is, in the medium term, though, I think we're going to see a lot of variations for powering motor vehicles, really between now and the end of the 2020s. So we'll have hybrids, we'll have plug-in hybrids, we'll have battery electric vehicles, and we'll still have some internal combustion engines. Right now, the one that everybody is focusing on, pure battery vehicles like Tesla makes, like the Nissan Leaf makes, are still impractical, mainly because of range and cost, and these are related to each other. And so for the most part, the appeal of these vehicles are to the true believers, the people who want to save the world. And to sell, they really still need subsidies. However, that's going to start to change. And we think that battery electric vehicles will ultimately prevail towards the end of the next decade. And there's a key reason for this, is the prices of lithium-ion batteries are dropping very rapidly. For example, when Nissan introduced the original Leaf around 2010, lithium-ion batteries, they cost about $1,000 per kilowatt hour. So you think about it, the $1,000, they had a 24 kilowatt hour battery in it. That was an enormously expensive car. Today, makers are a little bit secretive about where prices are, but around $200 seems about a safe bet per kilowatt hour. So that started to allow electric vehicles that offer decent range, so a lot of the range anxiety goes away, but are still really expensive. Some think, but this reduction in price is going to continue. Some think it might come sooner, but around the middle of the next decade, people think that the price of batteries will drop below $100 per kilowatt hour. That's when things start to get really interesting. Let's work through the numbers. Let's think about an EV with a pretty high range. I think General Motors Chevy Bolt is a perfect example. The Bolt has a US EPA range of 238 miles or 380 kilometers, so pretty long range. Now that's achieved with a 60 kilowatt hour battery. So at $100 per kilowatt hour, you're looking at a $6,000 battery pack. Now, the Bolt is a compact car, and if we think of a typical compact car, say one that costs around US $18,000, and typically the rule of thumb is that the drivetrain for an internal combustion engine is about a third of the cost, so we're talking about a $6,000 drivetrain. $6,000 battery pack. We're kind of at, at $100 per kilowatt hour, we're kind of at cost parity. The need for subsidies fade, and it's off to the races. So what will happen then? Like other technologies, there will be early adopters who educate the mainstream users. They'll find out that operating costs will be lower. Electricity is a lot cheaper than gasoline. Internal combustion engine car costs will rise as the regulatory burden rises. They will find out that maintenance is a lot less. There's very few moving parts in an electric vehicle. Charging time will be less of an issue. People will generally charge at home. If they live in condos, probably condos as they go forward will have charging ports for electric vehicles. So, all of this discussion we have about the need for a fast charging network and an infrastructure, it will be far less extensive than what we have for gasoline fueling. And indeed, most of the network and most of the cost for fueling electric vehicles is already there. It's called the electric power grid. So that's why, in addition to air pollution problems and climate change concerns, because of this price drop in batteries, governments are clued into this, and that's why we're starting to hear them taking action. China, which has had massive air pollution problems in its major cities, particularly the capital, are mandating a certain portion of EVs or a certain portion of car sales have to be electric. India is heading down the same direction. Maybe they're a little bit early with these demands, but you think about France, the UK, and even California is debating it, looking at internal combustion engine bans somewhere between 2030 and 2040. The old technology is on its way out. This is a problem for legacy automakers. They've got a big investment in internal combustion technology. It also battery electric vehicles invite competition. They're relatively easy. That's why we have startups like Tesla. When I was at CES week before last, saw one from China called Byton. There was a company that recently went bankrupt, Faraday Future, but a lot of new entrants. EVs are relatively easy compared to internal combustion engines. And internal combustion engines had been a big entry barrier for the auto industry. Moreover, automakers don't like battery electrics for another reason, is they find differentiation is hard when the most valuable thing in the car, the most expensive component, the battery, is being made by someone else, and someone else has all of the IP. This explains why you've been hearing a lot. You've been from like Toyota and others starting to look to other types of batteries, particularly solid state. More range, faster charging, lower fire risk. And based on what we're hearing, it's hard to know without being an insider, but our impression is that Toyota might be an early leader here. Just finally, when we're talking about batteries and plug-in hybrids and all these other technologies, I haven't talked much about fuel cell vehicles, which is an important thing in Japan. It's a technology that is being pushed by makers and the government. And the reason that makers love it, this notion of differentiation, complexity, creating entry barriers, are all important reasons. However, I'm skeptical that fuel cells will be a winner, at least for passenger cars. The main reason being is the rapid drop in cost for battery electric vehicles. And so it sort of comes down to sort of being a VHS versus a Betamax situation. Is if you're old enough to remember that, is the better technology did not win out because the other one was simpler and faster. The big problems I see with fuel cells is the fueling infrastructure, which for passenger cars would need to be fragmented, and the fueling stations are expensive. It's a big roadblock. The other roadblock I see is while fuel cell vehicles are perfectly cheap, the most common source for hydrogen, of industrial production for hydrogen, comes from steam reformation, not really a green process. Now, the pushback that if you're probably already thinking about it, well, what about EVs? They're fueled by dirty coal. That'll change. Really what EVs do is the auto industry can say, hey, we've done everything we can. Now the burden goes to the power generation industry to fix its problem. And probably just sort of on a social note is, at least with electric vehicles as opposed to fuel cells, if you're creating all of this demand for natural gas, you're creating a new carbon-intensive vested interest. Anyway, so I think batteries are going to be the winner. I think come a decade or a decade and a half from now, if I'm still doing meetings like this, it'll be a foregone conclusion. Anyways, thank you for listening, and over to Koji Endo.
Good. Thank you.
Okay, my name is Koji Endo, and I think I have met you, most of you, even though probably this is the first time to see you since I switched my job to SBI. And just some small information on SBI. SBI stands for SoftBank Investments. And there used to be a part of a SoftBank Group, but even at this point, there is no equity relationship between SBI and SoftBank Group. But anyway, I started working for this firm about 18 months ago. I started my career about 35 years ago as an equity analyst at the Nomura Securities, and at that time I was covering electronics, and 3 years later I was asked to move to the automotive sector. So since 1987 I have been covering this industry for about 30 years. And probably I'm old enough to say, well, in 3 months' time, I'm gonna turn to be 60 years old. So I'm gonna be probably old enough to claim the fact that the first meeting I had as an automotive analyst back in 1987 was the one-on-one face-to-face meeting with Honda Soichiro. And I asked him, what's the biggest concern that you might have at Honda? And his answer was that, well, Honda is already too big. 30 years ago, Honda was just selling about 2 million units. Now they are selling about 5.5 million units worldwide. But when they were selling only 2 million units, Soichiro was actually telling me that Honda was already too big. So ever since, 30 years has been passed, and we have seen a lot of changes. So at the beginning, when I started my career as an automotive analyst, the first thing that I had to do was to compare Toyota with Honda. 10 years later, I switched my job to UBS, and the first thing that I had to do at the non-Japanese firm was to compare Toyota with GM. And nowadays, probably, the completely new area that I have to cover is probably compare Toyota with Google. So that's the kind of things that we have been seeing over the last 35 years. But this, I have some handouts. I'm not really going to cover all the slides, but probably some of the key slides might interest you. This cover picture, as you can see, we have Ford F-Series pickup trucks, which probably generate 120% of Ford's profits. And on the right-hand side, we have a picture of Silicon Valley. I went to LA last December to attend the LA Motor Show, and then from LA to San Fran, I flew. And on that plane, from that plane, I took this picture. And I visited Tesla and Google and IBM and Intel and NVIDIA, the kind of things that I never had to do in the last 29 years. So the first time that I had to do nowadays. So we have, I think we have just started seeing some kind of major and drastic changes from right to the left as far as the car industry is concerned. And this is the keywords. Some of the names might interest you, but I think from Detroit to Dyson, which is obviously I'm just exaggerating a bit. But saying Dyson, there have been a number of completely newcomers in the industry, which I never dreamed of until just a couple of years ago. And we could have some small kind of commuter from Dyson as early as next year, and which might start competing against some of the traditional, like Detroit type of the business model in the near future. As working for one of the investment banks, I always have to start with the stock price, so share price performance, and this is the fact in 2017. This is 29 global major car makers, the list of their stock price performance, all in US dollar term. In order to compare Chinese and Japanese, German, and Americans, I converted all the numbers into US dollar based figures. And for calendar 2017, which car makers had better performance than others and which had not, and this is the fact. I think we can see, or we can find maybe 3 major things. The first thing is that dead end, the last 2, happen to be the Japanese. Mazda and Subaru. Actually, those 2 were the 2 worst performers during the calendar 2017 as far as their stock price is concerned. I'm not really saying Mazda is a terrible company. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that in terms of share price, those 2 happen to be the worst 2, which might tell you something. The second thing is that the top 10, those better performers, most of them are either Chinese or Indians or EV related. And then the third one is many of those what we call traditional major big car makers with a typical Detroit-based business model, with a much of profit contributions coming from the United States. Their performance have been generally really bad, including Toyota, Nissan, Honda, GM, Ford, Hyundai, Daimler, BMW, and so on and so on. So this is what happened, what we witnessed during 2017. The question mark is what's going to happen in 2018 and going forward. The same thing going to continue? Well, we could have a completely different picture from 2018. But generally speaking, I think this can really tell that the major players, at least from the market point of view, equity market point of view, seems to be completely changing. And we are now in the middle of the transition period. This is the profit for Japanese major 6 companies. And after they had to lose money at the Lehman crisis in 2009, their profitability, generally speaking, improved quite a bit until 2016. Well, it's as March 15. Well, it's actually March 16 at the top. So all those 7 straight years, their profitability improved, and then started weakening a bit in March 2017, and then this period. The profit margin topped at around 8% 2 years ago, but it has been gradually coming down. I think their profitability and fundamental outlook still seems to be very healthy, even though the peak seems to be over 2 years ago, and we have started seeing some more difficult period as far as I'm concerned. This is the market cap. Well, we compare those major companies by the number of cars they sell, what the profitability that they make. But again, for investment analyst, equity analyst, the typical field that we compare those car makers at market cap. And as you can see from this chart, Toyota is by far the top still, followed by 3 major Germans. I think last year it was reported that the Tesla exceeded GM and Ford at one point, but nowadays it's somewhere around between GM and Ford. But anyway, this is the top 5. It's very interesting that the Maruti Suzuki comes at the 9th place in this top league, even though Suzuki Motor, their parent company, is actually number, I'll say, 18th. So their Indian subsidiary is number 9, but their parent company is number 17 or 18, which is, I think, very, very interesting. And this is the number of volume that they sell on a global basis. Again, this one and this one. I mean, you're going to see a big difference between those 2. In other words, again, going back to the story at the beginning, I asked Honda Soichiro, well, Honda was just too big when they were selling only 2 million units. I think his concern is that just selling more and more and becoming bigger and bigger doesn't really solve any problem. That's not really his objective. And you can really tell this by selling so many numbers. Still, your value of the company is a lot smaller. And what's the point to sell so many cars if your value is so small? This is the U.S. market, and I think it's very interesting to compare this one with this one. It's page 4 and page 7. The trend is almost the same. So this is the U.S. market, and U.S. market topped 17.5 million back in 2016, and the bottom was in 2009. So the U.S. market continues to grow from 2009 to 2016. Well, last year we had a 1.8% volume decline. Well, still, the volume was very, very high. But still, we had some small decline. And we are actually expecting continuous decline in the United States market for 2018, probably about 16.7, maybe 16.8 million. That seems to be the consensus. And this almost exactly parallels the trend of Japanese profitability. So if we expect the U.S. market softens as far as car sales is concerned, or again, those car makers might have some difficulties. And this is one of the very interesting charts that in Japan, in the United States, light trucks now accounts for 65% of the overall market. By saying light trucks, we are mainly talking about pickup trucks and SUVs. And those two now accounts for 65%, even though historically this truck segment was around 50%. It's almost 50-50 market between trucks and cars. But nowadays, the main market has been SUVs and pickup trucks, and there seems to be a very strong correlation between this light truck sales and gas price. And the gas price in the United States is probably about $2.50 a gallon, and which is at the very lowest range in the last 10 years, and really depends on how you look at the gas price on a global basis. But probably, if the gas price stays at a relatively low level and stables, then probably this situation probably going to continue. So most of the people are talking about a case. Case means connected and autonomous and sharing and EVs. Those four characters that the Daimler came out at the Frankfurt Motor Show last year. Well, it was mostly EVs and all those electrification type of the vehicles that we witnessed at Frankfurt Motor Show. But again, when it comes to LA Motor Show last December and this Detroit Motor Show in January, actually, I must say 95% of those cars or those vehicles are actually SUVs and pickup trucks in the United States. And that's a fact. We are talking about Mr. Trump bitching about Japanese surplus against the United States and trade surplus. Yes, huge surplus, about $700 billion, and out of $700 billion, about 500, in other words, 70% of U.S. deficit against Japan in the trade comes from cars. So every time we hear some news regarding the economy or the trade friction between Japan and the United States, always this car industry is one of the top issues. This is another interesting one. I took this picture at the LA Motor Show last December. This is actually Acura MDX, made by Honda, Honda's East Liberty plant in Ohio. And you can find two circles, as it says, East Liberty, Ohio, USA. That's the origin. Now, you see 70%, that's the local content. But now NAFTA talks has been reviewed, and what the United States is asking is to raise that local content. Well, if those car makers want to enjoy 0% tariff between United States, Canada, and Mexico, they have to have minimum of 62.5% local content. 62.5 is a requirement. Now this MDX has 70%. That's why this MDX made in Ohio can be exported to Canada and Mexico without any tariff. Now, what the Trump administration is now asking is to raise that minimum requirement, 62.5% to 85%. And then at the same time, U.S. content has to be 50%. So if that happens, then this MDX made at Ohio East Liberty plant with local content only 70% cannot be regarded as US made. So Honda has no choice but to raise their local content from 70 to at least 85, and then out of 85, 50% has to be US content, which obviously is very, very, very difficult thing to do. As far as I'm concerned, it's probably impossible. But again, this is now what's being discussed in Washington, D.C., and I don't know if this happens or not. U.S. is threatening to withdraw from NAFTA, which might happen, might not happen, I really don't know. But if ever that happens, well, those car makers, including the Detroit 3, going to be in trouble. because they are all against. Now, turning to China, this is an ever-growing market, and we're probably going to have about 25 million this year, which is record high, obviously the biggest market in the world, and will continue to grow to about probably 30, just a matter of time. And this is, what traditionally we have been saying that when this what we call motorization starts, the point is when per capita GDP exceeds $5,000. So between $5,000 or $10,000, and all of a sudden, car ownership is gonna start skyrocketing, and that's what this shows. At the very bottom end, you can see India, Indonesia, and China is also still at the relatively low range. So if this in India or China or Indonesia continues to grow in terms of car ownership, well, on a global basis, at least car sales will continue to grow. That's kind of traditional argument. And is that really true or not? Well, this is the car ownership by 1,000 adults on a global basis, and we have had a pretty good tracking record up to now, even though, again, some of the people have started saying that we're going to start having huge sharing economy coming out. And if we start seeing this share economy spreading across the world, then actually car sales is going to be reduced by 20, 30, 40%. It really depends which person you're asking. But again, it has been discussed. I don't know if this is true or not, but at least 20, 30% at the end of the day could be reduced from that theoretical, traditional theory of car growth, which might be true. This is kind of CO2 emission standards, regulations in Japan, the United States, China, and Europe, and almost everywhere in the last 10 years. Regulation has been restricted, and actually the level of CO2 emission standards in 2025 is actually more than 50% less compared to 2015. So in the last 10 years, we have been seeing a significant reduction requirements on CO2 emission standard all over across the world. And part of that, we have been seeing a number of kind of new type of the vehicles, and Tesla has been one of the main topics. I went again, California, Silicon Valley, last December. Actually, I went to Tesla. I didn't have a privilege to see Mr. Elon Musk. No, I'm not really sure if my interviews with company is very reliable or not. I really don't know. But at least this is a fact. And the company lost about $700 million of net earnings in the third quarter. And this is mostly because of the fact that the picture that the Model 3, the production Model 3 seems to be kind of stalled. Mr. Musk was actually saying that by the end of 2017, they are going to make about 5,000 Model 3 a week. But the fact was that they made just 1,000 a month. So, and that seems to be still continuing. So it is said that the company will continue to lose money. There was even rumor that it's just a matter of time before Tesla are going to be on sale, and somebody else might be interested in taking over Tesla. I don't know. Again, this is true or not, but at least there was such rumor around. This is the cost of batteries. Chris was just talking. It used to be $1,000 per 1 kilowatt hour, and nowadays it's probably around 150 to 200. And it is expected. It's expected by 2020 the price gonna go below $100, And by 2025, or maybe by 2022 or through, the price is going to be about $50, which means in the last 15 years or 10 years, actually the cost on the price of batteries is actually down by 95%. It's a significant cost reduction, but still might not really be enough for those major car makers to make equivalent profit level that they are now making. Maybe Toyota's making a lot of money from selling 500,000 Camrys in the United States. But if these Camrys are going to become EV Camrys, and if Toyota is lucky enough to sell 500,000 EV Camrys, well, the question mark is, can they really make money out of EV Camrys? Even if they can sell 500,000 units of EV Camrys, and the question mark is really coming mainly from the cost of batteries here. Theoretically, if this Paris Accord is the right thing to follow, and we eventually going to see the CO2 emission going to be eliminated by 90% compared to the current level, then theoretically, this is what has to be done. And as far as I'm concerned, this is, again, impossible, maybe. So it's very difficult to imagine. Now, it should be done, but probably will not happen, and the gap between those two arguments is really the challenge that we are now facing. Page 21 is actually another very interesting chart that the Chinese seems to be making a substantial improvement in terms of the quality front in the last few years compared to against the global majors. And the difficulty that those Japanese and Germans and Americans are facing is that it's not supply and demand situation. It's actually national policy imposing how many of EVs and how many of certain vehicles have to be sold in China or somewhere or elsewhere. So the rule of sales volume is not really following supply demand. That's the kind of most challenging part as far as the Japanese and Americans and Germans are concerned. They have to follow national policy set by the communist country called China. And that's the kind of difficulty that we are all facing. This is what I kind of organized in terms of the time of the autonomous drive and level 4 and level 3 and so on and so on. Well, again, you never know because things seems to be changing every day. And again, we could see some completely newcomers, new players in this market. So you never know, but that this seems to be the case. So we're gonna soon start seeing level 3, 4, maybe not really level 4 and level 5, but maybe level 3 type of the vehicles in 2019. I don't know if you believe in singularity point. It is said in 2045 we are supposed to have singularity point where AI is supposed to be smarter than human being. And by that time, we could have this completely 100% autonomous, that's level 5, completely autonomous drive to be realized, at least in some of the advanced nations. Even though in the majority of the emerging markets, we still could have kind of conventional type of the vehicles still occupying the majority of the market. So it depends. We could have kind of zone 1 and zone 2 and zone 3, and zone 1 is mostly occupied by level 4 and 5, and zone 2 is kind of somewhere in between, like level 2 or level 3. And then zone 3 is completely conventional type of the market. It really depends on the country and regions and regulation of the traffic and so on and so on. So we could have the mixture, and this shows kind of hypothetical growth, that on the global basis, we could see completely autonomous driving, maybe in a third of the market by singularity point, but could be higher, could be lower. At the end of the day, my personal feeling is that the mobility on demand, that's the kind of ultimate style, ultimate type of the vehicles. So people do not really own car. It's shared, and it's completely autonomous, level 5, and it's probably completely EVs or maybe FCVs. So that MOD, that's the center of the three circles, and that's, I don't know how many or how much of that portion accounts out of the total market. Total market vehicle is so many of cars and trucks, and out of that, 20%, 30%, maybe 50%. I really don't know, but that's probably the trend by 2045, 2050 that we are heading for. So this is some comment from my side. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Endo-san. That was great. Very interesting presentation, and you covered a wide range of topics. Really, as a conversation starter for both you and Chris, thank you for outlining some of the issues. I think at this point we'll turn it over to questions from the floor. Please, when I'll call, raise your hand if you'd like to ask something. I'll call on you, and please identify yourself and your affiliation. We'll prioritize questions first from the working press, but anybody's free to ask. Go ahead. I saw back in there, Yuri, I think you raised your hand first. Sure, yes, please come up to the podium.
Yuri Kageyama with the Associated Press. About your presentation and the theory about EVs getting like bigger and bigger. I used to believe that too, but then as I keep watching this, what's going on, it's almost like this ideal for a nuclear-free world. It never happens. And of course, it makes sense that China would want to do it because this is their chance to really come ahead with this technology. But as Mr. Endo is saying, a lot of it is national policy. And look what's happening with the United States. Like, all you see are trucks. So, I mean, my question is like, how... is it really is it really going to be EVs? That's the ideal, that we move toward real pollution, against pollution? That would be a good, viable option if we really believe that we're moving toward, an ideal where we don't have pollution and global warming, et cetera. But, I mean, do you understand my question? Like,
are you asking me?
I'm asking both of you, but
okay.
I just feel really skeptical, and it's really confusing for us as journalists to try to even sell the story internally because there's just so much skepticism and so much confusion. I mean, why don't we just say we don't really know? If another president like Trump comes along, we might have United States being totally like combustion gasoline engine, and China could go totally electric, and and Japanese would just be buying Priuses. Is that really like a viable theory or a scenario for the future?
Okay, I'll give my answer, and maybe Koji has some insights too. My view is sort of based a little bit more on an economic view than a policy view, and I think that's why both Koji and I talked about the falling cost of lithium-ion batteries. And why I talked about this magic number, when you get to 100, you got cost parity, and if you go lower, you're getting to a point where electrics are cheaper than regular cars, in addition to, the operating costs being lower, and you also have some performance advantage and so on and so forth. So right now, today, EVs are not practical. And that was sort of the first point that I made. But as we continue down this cost curve, they start to get very attractive from an economic perspective, and we sort of break away from these policy things. It's like, Trump wants to do this, or the EPA wants to do this, or Chinese policy wants to do that. They're trying to force the market to go a certain way. But when you get to an economic point where there is a cost advantage to consumers and a convenience advantage, or those kind of things, then that's where I think the change is happening. But that point where that shift starts to occur is probably somewhere in the middle of the next decade. It's not today. So while there's a big buzz in the press and a big buzz from automakers, it's too early. It's not time yet. Koji?
Sure. Well, to be honest, I really don't know. Probably nobody knows. Nobody's sure. As Taylor has been saying from time to time, that we probably going to have 2 or 3 or 4 different types of vehicles anyway. By the definition of what the purpose of owning a car, or what's the purpose of having those cars. Affordability is one thing, economy of scale is another. And then at the same time, as I just mentioned, there has been, at least in the last few years, we have started seeing so many of political political influence, so to speak. So it's not just, again, as I said, pure demand and supply situation. Where certain type of vehicles are gonna be sold in certain areas. I mean, we're talking about a completely different type of the constraints nowadays, and that is the political pressure or political interest from some of the areas where we have never seen before. So, example, some people say, well, fuel cell. It's almost impossible. Elon Musk is saying, well, fuel cell. You must be dreaming. I mean, Carlos Ghosn is also saying that fuel cell, it's not really practical. Well, might be, might not be. Example, if we have kind of a fleet of big trucks delivering a lot of all those stuff from Tokyo to Osaka. Well, on the new Tomei and Meishin freeways, we could have big fuel cell stations at the Tokyo interchange intersection and Nagoya and probably Osaka. As long as we have those 3 fuel cell stations, well, we could have a huge flow of trucking transportation between Tokyo and Osaka, and from that hub, we could have kind of short-range EVs delivering all this stuff. So it really depends on the level of cost and national interests. But again, at this point, I think it's reasonable to say, and probably the market consensus seems to be, in order to clear some of the short-term restriction on CO2 and some of the emission standards, then probably we are going to continue to have a gradual increase of plug-in hybrid for the time being, maybe up until 2022, 2023. And then slowly we're going to start seeing EVs taking over plug-in. And EVs going to become probably the majority of the market by 2030, even though, again, EVs are probably still 20-30% of the market, and we could still have internal combustion engines and occupying 20-30%, and plug-in another 20-30%, and something else 20-30%, total of 100%. That's kind of the balance that the probably reasonably predicted. But again, I'm not really sure as far as those exact figures are concerned.
Okay, thank you. Yes, thank you.
Gentlemen, my name is Crowell. I'm a freelance writer. And my question is directed to all the members of the panel, including the moderator, if he cares to chime in. My question is, as he mentioned, we have just observed the 20th anniversary of the Toyota hybrid car. I'd like to know, what do you think we will be writing about in the year 2217 about Toyota, next 20 years?
Hans?
Which year? Which year was that?
20 years from now? And
20 years from now?
Yeah.
Okay.
2217.
2217.
I think that's 20 years from now. Maybe I'm wrong.
2037.
It's like
2038.
200 years from now.
Anyway, another 20 years.
Another 20 years. It's hard to say. I mean, if you follow Toyota's own guidelines, they're trying to. They have a 2050 vision, so that's beyond your horizon. But they want to reduce their basically carbon output by 90%. Basically, eliminate all internal combustion engines across its lineup by 2050. And they have a rollout program that is a little bit more conservative, maybe, than a lot of the other competitors that are going full bore into EVs. They still are sticking by their hybrid technology. They see plug-in hybrids as kind of a bridge technology to EVs. And but long term, they see kind of a hybrid solution, or a patchwork solution, I guess is a better way to put it, of hybrids, plug-in hybrids, and then EVs for short commutes, and then fuel cell vehicles for longer distances. So I think probably in 20 years' time, you're going to see a lot of EVs from them, a lot more EVs, and hopefully some more fuel cell vehicles, or at least they hope you'll see more fuel cell vehicles. I'm not as bullish as Toyota is about the future of that technology, but that to them is, at least publicly, a major keystone of their plan.
My view is, we either, we may, either be looking at Toyota as an even more successful company than it is now, or we might end up looking at it like we look at Kodak today. So there is, and so, Akio Toyoda is right to view what's going on right now as an existential crisis, and there's a couple of scenarios that can come to pass. One scenario is, okay, maybe Toyota really does have a lead in solid state batteries. Maybe they get there. Maybe they take a bigger chunk of the market than they have now, and they will be known as the company that transformed the industry. The very bear cases be maybe that happens, but we get to level 5 autonomous driving, and we have driving on demand, something that Koji was talking a little bit about, and so the vehicle fleet condenses massively. And so that you have cars that are being used a lot more, they're more durable, but because they're used a lot more, annual demand goes down, and a lot of players are forced out of the marketplace. And a lot of these names might be of historic interest or be disrupted out of the industry, like Kodak. So I mean, I see, depending on how things play out, there could be an extreme range of possibilities 20 years from now.
Endo-san, would you like to add some thoughts?
Well, there is now Shiriko Toyota Motor Corporation, and I think Toyota will probably drop that motor part, and the name of Toyota Motor Corporation is going to be changed to Toyota Corporation, or Toyota Mobility Service. So how to make money, the way to make money is probably totally different. That's the reason. So that's probably going to happen in the next 20 years.
Okay. Sean?
Hi, Sean McClain from the Wall Street Journal. I think I've spoken to both of you guys on the phone. So I got kind of two questions. One, sort of in your day job, when you talk about the fragmentation of sort of powertrains going forward in the near future, what does that do to profit margins in your eyes, and how does that sort of affect both how you think about the companies and any sort of impact you might think that might have on how they do business? And sort of secondly, you guys talked a lot about how this is the EV drive is coming from subsidies and government policies. Is there anything in either the 20-year history of the Prius or anything else when we look at emissions cuts that might make you think that consumer demand might take over at some point to replace the push from government, or not?
You want to go first, or? Oh, okay. Let's see, Sean. The first part was
on Well, we're talking about diversified demand.
Oh, okay, negative for margins or whatever. Yeah, I think, I mean, it increases the complexity of what they have to manufacture, and also it also forces them to research more stuff. So, yeah, we're sort of in a technological arms race in the industry. So there is going to be ongoing pressure on the makers to do this. Plus, for example, Toyota, is looking at mobility services. Their presentation at CES in Las Vegas focused on that. So they're having to look at a lot of other things. So yeah, it is. They will have to find other saving. Let's put it a more optimistically way. They will have to find other savings in their cost structure to make up for the burdens of investing in all this technology. But by itself, it's a negative, point of pressure on them. And then the second part.
Well, on EV demand, I mean, you're quite bullish on EVs eventually taking over.
Oh, yes, get rid of the subsidies and stuff.
Oh yeah. At what point do you see the dynamics and the balance between government pushing and consumer demand? At what point do EVs sort of become attractive to people?
I think what the point is when, first off, when you get to a cost point that's low enough and people can start to sell electric vehicles more cheaply than internal combustion engines, that will be an important change factor, and I think that you will have a group of early adopters out that will do it. They will discover that not only would the cost be cheaper, but the cost of ownership will be lower, and they'll find other advantages and stuff, and they will convey that to their friends, families, and acquaintances, and so it will roll out like any other piece of technology. But the key thing that has to happen is the cost of the vehicles has to be similar, preferably lower than internal combustion engines for this to really start to take hold.
Well, generally speaking, as I said, the profitability is under pressure. And, for example, in Japan, all the listed companies, 1 out of 3 are making record high profits for this year, and 1 out of 4 are seeing record high stock price at this point, even though, as far as Toyota is concerned, almost everything is in between 60 to 70%. Their profitability this year is about 70% compared to the peak. Their share price right now is about 70% compared to the peak. Even though U.S. market was record high 2 years ago, and last year it was very close to that record high. Yen was not really that unfavorable. Yen was around 112 against US dollar, which was not too bad. China was very strong last year. Yet, Toyota's profitability is about 70% compared to the peak, even though there are a lot of companies in Japan who are making record high profits. The reason is, again, cost pressure is so huge. I mean, most of them is probably about what they call fixed cost. Here, fixed costs include mainly R&D, capital expenditure and depreciation, labor costs, those three, as well as selling costs. I mean, incentives continues to rise. So all those things are actually killing Toyota's profitability already in 2017 when U.S. market was almost at the record. If we continue to have more and more EVs coming out, I think it's very reasonable to expect Toyota's profitability continues to be under pressure. Toyota is making about 6% OP margin this year compared to 10% at the peak, which was only 2-3 years ago. Because they continue to pay a lot of money for autonomous drive and EVs and blah, blah, blah. And I don't think that situation is going to completely be changed. Obviously, what Toyota is hoping to start making money out of those huge investments sometimes in the future, but that's probably years away, or there's even possibilities they never be able to make as high profitability as they used to. That's why they have to chase for something completely different way to make money, which they never had experienced before. And the question mark is, can they really find the new areas to make money, or the new ways to make money? Well, that's still the question mark that we have to ask.
Okay, thank you. Yes.
Süddeutsche Zeitung, Neidert. Question to both of you gentlemen. I think it's 25 years ago when Toyota started to develop the Prius. In the States, mineral water was more expensive than gasoline. And Toyota was a pioneer. I remember the Mercedes people laughing at Toyota, making this gadget for the intellectuals or so. Now, of course, Toyota has been extremely successful with the Prius, and at the beginning of this revolution of the car industry. Now Toyota is at best and also run, and Toyota is at the top of the pack in Japan. So the more general question: why has Japan lost this energy Toyota showed when they went against the current in '93?
Why has Toyota sort of lost its edge compared to when they first launched the Prius?
Why are the Japanese no longer seen as these innovators that they were when Toyota came out with the Prius 20 years ago? And that's, why did they lose their mojo?
I like mojo. That's a good question. I don't know if I have a totally satisfying answer to that question. It's a thing that I've wondered about myself. I think that part of the problem is the more successful you become, the more conservative you tend to be, and you take less risks. And I think there's also and there was also a recognition that that this stuff was far away from being ready, or there wasn't a vision that it could be ready. I think probably on the electrics there was a vision that, well, hey, where's our differentiation in this? How can we be different? And why they continued to plow ahead, both Toyota and Honda, for fuel cells as long as they have. Granted, fuel cell technology was on the scene before the lithium-ion battery was invented, so there was a lot of momentum there, and they said, okay, this is the way we want to go. And you had a strong group of people researching them in the companies and their careers. A vested interest in the success of this, might have slowed them down from doing this, but I think they became more conservative and more stuck in their ways. I know there was a lot of resistance at both Toyota and Honda to looking at autonomous vehicles. They said no, cars shouldn't drive themselves. People should drive cars, and even Toyota has a logo, I forget what they call it, but that sort of has like half a machine and half a person, and showing that the driver is still engaged in the car. So they don't like the idea of making robocars. So I think there's also some philosophical differences with some of these technologies that have caused them to go slow. And I think now they've started to, particularly Toyota has started to recognize that this is going to change the industry, and is scrambling to get back in the game, or to be in the game, and realize and trying to shake off some of the complacency. I think maybe Honda's a couple steps behind that, but but I think but I think some of these things work together to make them slow to accept this change in the world that is now becoming more visible.
Okay. As far as I'm concerned, it's probably fair to say the Germans invented automobiles back in 1886. Well, some people say it was French, but as far as the kind of automobiles are concerned, Mr. Benz and Mr. Daimler invented automobiles at the beginning. And 20, 30 years later, Mr. Henry Ford came out in Detroit, and he invented mass production systems so that the price tag of automobiles was reduced by like a third or down by like 78%, so that anybody can start buying cars. It was about early 1900s. And 60, 70 years later, Japanese came out in the main scene, and they did what they call Kaizen, and they improved quite a bit into major fronts. One is quality, and the other is fuel economy, those two. So it was Germans and Americans improved that industry, and then Japanese followed. And now we are now slowly moving into multinationals as far as I'm concerned. So there are going to be increasing number of completely newcomers, Chinese, maybe Indians, maybe Dyson-like, or maybe Google. So completely different style of the business model is now coming into this industry, and then which probably going to be totally taken over by artificial intelligence by 2045, as I said, when we have what they call singularity point. So theoretically, if ever this singularity point is realized, then AI is supposed to be smarter than human beings. So human beings are not supposed to drive a car. So from time to time, I dream that by 2045, probably officially, human beings are prohibited from driving a car because AIs are much more intelligent, and there is no traffic accident, and fuel economy is a lot better, and emission standards are going to be a lot lower, and we have significantly better and more efficient economy. So if that happens, then human beings should not be involved in the process of driving cars. So that's a kind of continuous kind of change, and some people completely kind of taking over somebody else, and that seems to be the case in the history, at least in the last 120 years. So I understand that recently, because of the Nissan's or Subaru case, or maybe Kobe Steel case, and some other Japanese companies involved in the kind of fraud or some quality problems, inspection problems, blah, blah, blah. So that some people say, well, the quality standard of the Japanese corporations seems to be kind of downgraded or substantially, blah, blah, blah. Well, I really don't think so. I mean, the majority of the companies are still doing just fine. As I said, 1 out of 3 companies are just making record high profits, just doing fine. But from time to time, we do have this kind of problem, especially in recent years, because of the SNS and so on and so on. We started seeing some completely different types of the communication tools, so that some of the charges might be realized more than before. But basically, the industry is just doing fine. But again, it is also the fact that the technologies and the style of the business model seems to be completely, continuously changing. Well, somebody else seems to be taking over somebody else. And that's now what we are now saying. Japanese are not really exceptional. I think Germans and Americans and some of the nationals kind of have been seeing the same thing. So.
Okay, very good. Any other questions from the floor? We'll open up to everybody now. Anybody with a question, curiosity, please.
I am affiliate, and the name is Honda, Roy Honda. Unfortunately, I have no concern about Honda family. But anyway, I have a question about different angle of EV or battery pack. Well, disposal or recycling of battery pack. I'm concerned about how should I put it? Facing a different type of environmental problem in the near future. The other day I visited the Nissan dealer and interested in new Leaf. The guy said to me that, 200,000 kilometers guarantee for Leaf and 8 years guarantee, or whichever faster or earlier. And I asked him that, what about the next? What about after that? And he said, Nissan doesn't think about that, or nobody experienced that kind of situation when 200,000 kilometers out or after 8 years. So it is too much to say, but nuclear energy, like nuclear energy, after 10 years or 15 years or 20 years, a lot of EV are dominating the world, and after that, such kind of a huge number of old battery pack coming out. Then, what will happen if you have such kind of perception or answer, or who is responsible, or what kind, such kind of opinion you have? Then please teach us or teach me. Thank you.
Thank you. I think that's an excellent question. And I don't know that there's a firm answer there, but I think the main, first off, the main thrust of what manufacturers will want to do is to capture old batteries and recycle them. So, for example, when you think about conventional cars and you have lead acid batteries, approximately 95% of them are recycled. One from the perspective of recapturing those materials so you can use them in new batteries, and secondly, of course, because these are chemicals that you don't want in the environment. In lead acid batteries, you don't want that in the environment. You don't want cobalt in the environment. But manufacturers, because of the high cost of the materials, will want to recycle them and recapture them. For example, one issue or one roadblock to electrification of cars we haven't touched on is the ballistic path that some of the raw material costs have taken over the last couple of years. I think cobalt is up 4 times. Over this period of time, lithium is very high, and so they will want to recapture them. And just in that similar vein, one of the interesting things that's been going on with the Nissan Leaf, if you ever take a look at resale values of old Nissan Leafs, it's really bad. They lose a tremendous amount of their value. I know, for example, that. I think there's, like, you can see ads for used Leafs, that, started life as, $35,000 cars is, being, $10,000 or $15,000, after a relatively short period of time. And it's because as the batteries cycle, they lose their capacity to hold charge, just like your cell phone does. The same process takes place. And I know that Nissan, for example, in the States, Nissan has a program, you can put a new battery in the car, and they give it to you for a cheap price, like $5,000. And you basically have a new car. But part of that cheap price is Nissan wants the battery. They want to get the battery and they want to take it apart and capture the materials. So the automakers do have a vested interest in getting the battery, not just from the perspective of keeping it from polluting the environment, but also to keep the business model going and being able to remanufacture batteries cost effectively.
Well, I think the recycling issue is always one of the biggest headaches that we have to face for the time being. And nowadays, many of those car makers are now thinking is to kind of do the reuse or those kind of used batteries for automobiles into electric appliances or housing related, so that eventually all those batteries are going to be used for something else. But again, which is probably not really the structural solution. And some of the companies now, Toyota is probably a typical example, that the current lithium-ion battery is going to be gonna see the end of their life cycle, and then pretty soon they're gonna come up with all solid batteries, which has probably a better chance to be for the reusage. And so we will continue to have kind of, again, the different type of the new type of the batteries, which probably has better ways for for the recycling. But again, this probably will continue to be there as one of the biggest problems that we have to face, and that's all I can say at this point. So.
Okay, thank you. Yes, thank you.
Thank you for your presentation. I'm an affiliate member, Christian House. I work in finance. The observation I would have is the Toyota Group is, as you've noted several ways in your presentations, is becoming the representative of Japan Auto Inc. And they are making a lot of investments and supporting and affiliating with various people. The specific is, do you approve of their affiliation and support of Mazda? And the bigger question is, what do you think they should be investing next? They have a fair amount of cash. How do you think they should be using it to prepare for this next couple of challenging decades ahead? Thank you.
Thanks, Christian. My view on Mazda, the Mazda one is a tricky one to understand. I mean, obviously, it's very clear what Mazda wants from Toyota. They're a smaller company. There's a huge technological burden of developing all this stuff, which is probably more than they can handle in the long term. And so, yeah, they want to pitch their tent next to Toyota. And actually, what's been interesting over the last couple of years, quite a few of the smaller Japanese automakers have pitched their tent next to Toyota, and of course now Mitsubishi has been sucked into the Nissan. So you have some consolidation. That this technology trend, is encouraging some consolidation in the industry. Now, what does Toyota get out of Mazda? That's a tough one. I know the public statements are like, oh, well, we like how Mazda does a lot of things on the cheap and blah, blah, blah. But I don't know if I'm persuaded by that, and I don't have a lot of evidence to support a view on this. But, I just wonder if Toyota didn't like having an automaker unaffiliated with anybody, just sort of wandering around there, for the potential that maybe Google could take a stake, or Apple, or somebody else. Because the last thing you want is, we've been talking about new entrants, and we've seen from the example of Tesla how difficult it is to learn automaking, the problems that they have. Wouldn't it be great if you're a well-capitalized technology company to have a stake in a good automaker? And so, I just wonder to an extent if the Toyota, approach to Mazda is a big no trespassing sign, and to other potential suitors of Mazda. That's the most plausible thing that I can think of. But, it's just purely my speculation. I don't have anything to hang my hat on there, but that's just a view.
Yes, in Japan we have about 11 car makers. Out of 11, Toyota has 7. So with Toyota Group is composed of 8 companies. And we have Nissan Mitsubishi Group and Honda just by itself. So we have actually 3 car groups in Japan, even though we have 11 car makers, but at least, practically speaking, 7 belongs to Toyota. And then at the same time, not all the time, but Toyota from time to time is willing to take over or do what they call cross-shareholdings. So take over some certain percentage of equity, which is not necessarily popular, because Japan Inc. has been developed on the basis of cross-shareholdings, which actually made Japanese society very rigid. And in the last so many years, that process and the system has been kind of dissolved, and the market got more freedom, so to speak, and equity front, and which actually was probably a good thing. But as far as Toyota is concerned, against that movement, Toyota seems to be interested in taking over some of the others' equity, so which is not really necessarily popular. I think Toyota has kind of dilemma, so to speak. Yes, Toyota has huge cash at this point, probably about 6 trillion yen of cash. What are they going to do about this 6 trillion? Well, Toyota said, well, Toyota is a huge company, but at the same time, when Lehman Shock comes out, and even Toyota has to lose a lot of money. And then at the same time, Toyota has to spend 1 trillion of capital expenditures, 1 trillion of R&Ds, and provide 3 trillion labor costs, and Abe-san is asking another 3% wage hike. So the labor cost can continue to rise. For the autonomous drive, for the EVs and FCVs, and some for internet and so on, they continue to have to spend a lot of money, and that probably R&D continues to rise. So if that's the case, well, 6 trillion might not really be enough. But at the same time, many investors are saying, well, they just have too much of cash, and they have to return some of the cash to the investors. So either through own buyback, or maybe do some big M&A-related activities so that they can find some different way of making money. That sort of thing. So Toyota is kind of standing at very difficult situation, very tricky situation at this point. I understand that's one of the reasons that, again, as I said, Toyota's share price is only at 70% compared with the peak. From many investors' point of view, Toyota is not necessarily that popular stock, though. So I think Toyota has a lot of reason to keep that 6 trillion, but at the same time, I really don't think 6 trillion is the right number, or they have to reduce that number to maybe 2 or 3 trillion, and 4 trillion has to be paid back to the investors, or maybe they have to use that extra 4 trillion to take over somebody else or do something else. So, well, that's up to Akio Toyota and what they are going to do with this extra cash. Or seems to be extra cash. But that's, I think, the dilemma and the challenges that they have to face.
Thank you. Any other questions from the floor? Yes, please.
Thank you for the presentation. My name is Kurt Sieber. I'm an associate member. We hear a lot about solid state recently, also in connection with North Korea and their rockets fuel. Could you give us some kind of an overall view of what is this all about? How does the solid state battery work? Thank you.
Okay, I'm not a battery. Well, first off, I think solid fuel Korean rockets and solid state batteries completely different animals. But in the case of batteries, what the advantage is here that Toyota is hoping for is, first off, a higher energy density than is being achieved in batteries right now. Also achieving quicker charging times. And also one of the other promises of solid state is that it's a lower fire risk. Just physically, the difference that you're dealing with is batteries currently, they refer to electrolytes now as liquid electrolytes. It's it's more properly described as a paste. And basically what this is, the electrolyte, be it solid or be it a paste, is the place where batteries, where the ions flow from between cathode and anode, depending on recharging. So batteries are kind of like waterfall devices. You pump all the water up somewhere and then it comes down. Then you pump them back up and it falls. It's just batteries work basically the same way. And so the electrolyte is what's between anode and cathode, and that's where the ions travel back and forth. And so anyway, so that's what they're trying to re-engineer, and that's what they're trying to do, is just get the higher energy density so the car can go further. You're trying to get quicker charging time so you don't have to spend so much time charging. And then also a reduction in fire risk. The electrolytes that you have in batteries now are highly flammable. And that's been, one of the well-documented risks in this area. And just talking to people in the battery field, the people that really know this stuff, I'm just a guy who absorbs information from experts, is what they had been telling me for a long time is when you would ask them, what is the next big thing in battery? Because you hear people bandying around these different battery technology. You hear about lithium air or magnesium ion and all these different things being bandied around. And they say solid state is the next big thing that and this is before Toyota's, this thing became obvious a few months ago, that this is where people are pouring a lot of research into. And now we're sort of on the brink of, people are starting to say we may be in a point to commercialize this sometime in the next 7 or 8 years. Or at least Toyota's saying that. They're saying, the early 2020s.
What kind of materials are being used? That's still
I did look. It still would be a lithium-based material. I did look at one technical paper that I will admit I did not really understand, but they had these enormously long chemical formulas of what the material is, and when you look at this stuff, unless you're an expert, you very quickly feel out of your depth and. Look at something else. So I don't know exactly the precise composition of the material.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Endo-san, anything to contribute or?
Well, if we have, as some of the people predicting, the number of EVs are going to be widespread, so that the number of EVs on the roads is going to be 10 times more, 20 times more. The question mark, the problem is the price tag of lithium going to skyrocket. There's going to be a severe, significant shortage of lithium. And then at the same time, some of the rare metals that all those batteries are going to use, either it's a conventional lithium-ion or solid-state battery, a lot of those rare metals are actually seen in China. And there is always kind of risk to see some restriction on exports from China. So that really depending on which metal, rare metal they are going to use, but there's always a kind of risk, strategic risk in terms of price and availability of those. So it's kind of reasonable to expect for those car makers and battery makers to seek for a completely new technologies, which doesn't really depend overly, at least, depend on the supply of those rare metals in China, or maybe just the price of those lithium-ion or some certain metals. So that's kind of the basic starting point, I would say. And then at the same time, again, at this point, the conventional lithium-ion battery that for example, Nissan Leaf use, which is probably half the production cost. So the price reduction, which already we have seen 90% of the price tag reduction in the last 10 years, as I explained before, but continuous price reduction is essential to make money. And then at the same time, all those devices and batteries has to be a lot smaller than it is now, a lot lighter, and all those things, challenges are there. So I understand that many of those car makers are trying to come up with a lot smaller and lighter and cheaper batteries, and they are now making a lot of efforts in doing that. And solid metal is one of those new type of the batteries. So.
Thank you. We don't have much time left, but may I interject with a kind of an offbeat question of my own? You talked a little bit about artificial intelligence today, and that brings us to the Japanese automakers Honda and Toyota, which have long-running robotics programs with these kind of helper robots or humanoid robots. What is the purpose of these programs? How important are they when they were started, let's say, and how important have they become now that artificial intelligence and robotics are now becoming central to autonomous driving? Do these programs have any newfound relevance to the future of cars for these companies?
My view, I'll take a hardline view, is I think they're toys.
Okay.
And I don't think they add a lot.
Okay.
But but that's just a view. Obviously, artificial intelligence is very important to autonomous driving, and maybe their engineers gained something from their involvement, but I think it could be probably a lot better directed in working at the problem at hand, rather than creating dancing robots or robots that play the trumpet and so on.
Do they have any application in the automotive field? Why are they doing it? I think, why? Because they can, but does it I don't see a lot of value add in these programs, to be quite honest. Endo-san, same opinion?
Well, I think which is a part of the continuous kind of improvement in the research and R&D field. I mean, you kind of have human-like robots in the back seat, actually in the passenger seat, and then let them kind of how they detect all those kind of different signals, or maybe how they feel. What's the impact when something really sudden, kind of unexpected thing happen? All the things are gonna be scaled by those robots. So that's one part of the R&D process. But I think the human-like robots is just a part of the R&D process. As I said, well, I mentioned the singularity point 2045, which is only 27 years from now. Only 27 years from now. So the last 30 years, we had a huge change in some of the automotive field. And for the next 27 years, I'm sure we're going to have significantly more changes in the automotive-related technology, including all those AIs. We have continuous deep learning process, and we have kind of neural kind of improvement in this AI field, so that theoretically, again, as I said, by 2045, at least in some of the areas in the world, human beings are not really allowed to drive a car. So to that point, and we have to have that the probability of being safe has to be 100%, not 99.999%. We have to have 100%. So up to that, well, this human-like robot is probably just a fraction of those R&D process, and we have a lot of those different areas to talk about in terms of the improvement of R&D or AI field. So that's probably we're going to continue to see.
Okay. Well, we have just a couple minutes left, but maybe we can open it up to one last question if there are any left over. Any final?
I have one more if you want to fill up the time.
Okay, let's ask if there's anybody else who hasn't asked a question yet. Any leftovers? No? Going once, going twice? All right, fire away.
Well, this is actually more a comment than a question. I was at NEPCON 2018 last week at the big site, and electronic and robots. And one impression I got there was that, as just was pointed out, humanoid robots that are toys. The whole robotic whole, which was much more about what is called now factory automation than human-type robots. But the other thing I wanted to mention is that among all those electronic and electric companies, more than half, perhaps 2/3 of the companies are developing new products for the car industry. It's the electronics are becoming the mainstay of the car industry, if you go by the impression you get at NEPCON. Thank you.
Well, I'll trade a comment for a comment. One comment of Koji's that really resonated with me early in his presentation is about learning stuff that you never thought you would have to learn about in your life. Just coming back from CES, I found myself reading a couple lengthy articles about artificial intelligence, something I never thought I would, have a need to know about. And certainly, it's interesting that I have on a regular basis, securities analysts were organized into different fields, and like I'm the autos guy, but increasingly I have the electronics guys coming over to my desk and asking, what do you think about demand in this market or for this type of product and stuff like that, because I needed to fill in what my expectations for certain technology areas are. So the interlinking of technologies and automotive is tremendous.
True. All right. Well, if there are no other questions, then I think we can wrap up today's presentation. I'd like to thank Mr. Endo and Mr. Richter very much for coming out and sharing your expertise with us. It seems like we touched on a wide variety of topics, but some of the trends were, of course, that the future is very uncertain and is changing very fast, and there's a big overlap of new or of existing fields and industries that didn't necessarily interact before, and a flood of new entrants from places that weren't previously expected, new countries and other new industries. So thanks again to our analyst guests. And as per our custom here at the club, I'd like to present you both with a small token of our thanks for coming and spending your time with us. It's a honorary 1-year membership at the club, so please come back and join us. This is for you, Chris.
Thank you.
Thank you.